Welcome, everyone. My name is Jamal Ilyas. I'm the director of the Wolf Humanities Center, which is the Center for the Humanities at the University of Pennsylvania, and the organization that has the primary distinct pleasure to actually welcome our speaker today and host this event, and to welcome all of you for coming out for what I really expect to be a fantastic and engaging evening or afternoon. Before I have a lot of introductions to do. So I think, if you want to go grab a large popcorn and some milk duds, you can do that. But before that, before I actually turn everything over to the panel, the setup actually is that our guest is going to be speaking with two faculty members at our university. So it's going to be mostly a conversation. I plan to introduce all of them and before I sit down and join you. So first of all, this is our Dr. S.T. Lee Distinguished Lecture, which is our main distinguished lecture at the Wolf Humanities Center every year. The Lee Distinguished Lecture Series in the Humanities brings together to the Wolf Humanities Center scholars and artists whose work has advanced our understanding of issues central to the humanities. The series is named for Seng T. Lee, a business executive and noted philanthropist. Dr. Lee is director of the Lee Group of companies in Singapore and of the Lee Foundation. In addition to the Lee Endowment and the Wolf Humanities Center itself, today's lecture and today's distinguished lecture is also co-sponsored by the Department of English and the Asian American Studies program at the University of Pennsylvania. So what I'll do is first I want to introduce my two wonderful colleagues, and I should close this. My two wonderful colleagues and then our distinguished guest. So one is Professor Josephine Park, is professor of English and a member of this faculty steering committee of the Asian American Studies program at the University of Pennsylvania. She specializes in modern and contemporary American literature and culture with an emphasis on American poetry and Asian American literature. She is the author of Apparitions of Asia, Modernist Form and Asian American Poetics, which reads a modern history of American literary alliances with East Asia. This book was awarded the Literary Book Award by the Association of Asian American Studies. She's also author of Cold War Friendships, Korea, Vietnam, and Asian American Literature, which came out in 2016, which examines Asian American subjectivities shaped by wartime alliances in Korea and Vietnam. She is the co-editor of Asian American Literature in Transition, and of Ezra Pound in the Present, Essays on Pound's Contemporaneity. She has served on a number of editorial boards and obviously published articles widely. My other colleague joining us is Professor Dagmawi Woubshet, who is the Ahuja Family Presidential Associate Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the topic director. Our Humanities Center runs on an annual topic series. So our topic this year is migration, and this lecture fits in migration. So Dag is our topic director, and we've had a lot of wonderful events, and obviously we work closely together. A scholar of African American literature and art, Dagmawi Woubshet works at the intersection of African American, LGBTQA+ and African studies. These overlapping areas of inquiry inform his scholarship and research, including his book, The Calendar of Loss, Race, Sexuality, and Mourning in the Early Era of AIDS, which came out in 2015. And he has a co-edited volume, Ethiopia, Literature, Art, and Culture, as a special issue of Kalalu. His writings have appeared in various publications, including Transitions, NKA, Journal of Contemporary African Art, The Atlantic, and African Lives. He is currently completing two book projects, James Baldwin and the Art of Late Style, and the first English translation of Sibhat Gebre Egziaber's 1966 Amharic novel, Sibateg no Melak, which means the seventh angel. Woubshet is an associate editor of Kalalu and has served on the board of directors of the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He has been a fellow at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies at Addis Ababa University, a scholar in residence at Modern Art Museum in Addis Ababa, where he curated shows there. And most recently, he was the inaugural senior fellow at the Africa Institute in Sharjah, the United Arab Emirates. Before joining the University of Pennsylvania in 2017, Woubshet taught at Cornell, where he was named one of the 10 best professors at Cornell. So, and he's also great here. And now on to our very distinguished guest. Viet Thanh Nguyen and his family came to the United States as refugees during the Vietnam War in 1975. I'm going to move him further forward so I can actually see him. Height challenged is a problem, you know. As he grew up in America, he began to notice that most movies and books about the war focused on Americans, while the Vietnamese were silenced and erased. He was inspired by this lack of representation to write about the war from a Vietnamese perspective, globally reimagining what we thought we knew about the conflict. The New York Times says that Viet Thanh Nguyen's novel, The Sympathizer, and I quote, fills a void, giving voice to the previously voiceless, while it compels the rest of us to look at the events of 40 years ago in a new light. His voice is refreshing and powerful as he urges readers to examine the legacy of the tumultuous time and its aftermath from a new perspective. The audacious novel has also been described by The Guardian as having a Whitman-like multiplicity, as it, quote, reads like the absolute opposite of Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. The Committed, the long-awaited follow-up to The Sympathizer, was published in 2021 and has been called a masterwork and revelatory. Viet's book, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, was a finalist for the National Book Award. Author Ari Kelman praises Nothing Ever Dies, saying it, quote, provides the fullest and best explanation of how the Vietnam War has become so deeply inscribed into national memory. His collection of short stories, The Refugees, explores questions of immigration, identity, love, and family. In 2018, Viet called on 17 fellow refugee writers from around the globe to shed light on their experiences, and the result is The Displaced, a powerful dispatch from the individual lives behind current headlines, which proceeds to support the International Rescue Committee. Viet was the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Award grant. The MacArthur Foundation noted that Viet's work not only offers insight into the experiences of refugees past and present, but also poses profound questions about how we might more accurately and conscientiously portray victims and adversaries of other wars. Along with teaching at the University of Southern California, he works as a cultural critic at large for the Los Angeles Times. Viet lives in LA with his wife and 2 children. So please invite Viet and my colleagues onto the stage to begin the event.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and you know, thanks for having me here. It's always a delight to be here at Penn. I thought I'd start off with just a couple of short excerpts of reading from The Committed and The Sympathizer. And of course, part of what's on my mind is what's happening in Ukraine. I've certainly been getting many, many questions from people about what I think about what's happening in Ukraine and the situation with Ukrainian refugees. And when I wrote The Sympathizer and The Committed, I mean, these are clearly novels about the war in Vietnam and about colonialism in Vietnam. But in my mind, these were also novels about war and colonialism in general. That what I wanted to do was to try to establish that from our perspective as Americans, this Vietnam War that's been such a preoccupation for the United States, that idea of a preoccupation actually obscures the ways in which that war was simply one episode in a much longer history of warfare that the United States has been waging pretty much since it was founded. And if we think about it in that fashion, it makes complete sense that the United States went into Indochina and took over the French colonial effort there. So that's what those 2 novels are supposed to do. And one other thing that they try to do is to clearly establish that when we talk about war, we also have to talk about refugees. That wars throughout the 20th century have killed more civilians than soldiers. I'm sadly and fairly certain this will be the case in the 21st century as well. And that wars inevitably produce refugees. And that's certainly what we're seeing in Ukraine. So I'm going to read first from The Committed, a passage about refugees, and then I'm going to read from The Sympathizer, a passage about Hollywood and media representation. Because I think what we're also seeing in Ukraine and the war and everything going on around it is partly a battle over narratives, over the control of media and social media, and Hollywood has its role to play. And when I say Hollywood, as you'll see from the excerpt, I really mean America's Ministry of Propaganda as a part of our military industrial complex in which we're all invested, whether we want to be or not. So in The Committed, it picks up exactly where The Sympathizer leaves off. If you haven't read The Sympathizer, shame on you. Basically The Sympathizer does live at the end of that novel. And at the end of the novel, we see him fleeing from Vietnam on a refugee boat. And in The Committed, it picks up exactly at that moment. And here we are on the refugee boat. We, the unwanted, wanted so much. We wanted food, water, and parasols, although umbrellas would be fine. We wanted clean clothes, baths, and toilets, even of the squatting kind, since squatting on land was safer and less embarrassing than clinging to the bulwark of a rolling boat with one's posterior hanging over the edge. We wanted rain, clouds, and dolphins. We wanted it to be cooler during the hot day and warmer during the freezing night. We wanted an estimated time of arrival. We wanted not to be dead on arrival. We wanted to be rescued from being barbecued by the unrelenting sun. We wanted television, movies, music, anything with which to pass the time. We wanted love, peace, and justice, except for our enemies, whom we wanted to burn in hell, preferably for eternity. We wanted independence and freedom, except for the communists, who should all be sent to re-education, preferably for life. We wanted benevolent leaders who represented the people, by which we meant us and not them, whoever they were. We wanted to live in a society of equality, although if we had to settle for owning more than our neighbor, that would be fine. We wanted a revolution that would overturn the revolution we had just lived through. In sum, we wanted to want for nothing. What we most certainly did not want was a storm, and yet that was what we got on the seventh day. The faithful once more cried out, God, help us. The non-faithful cried out, God, you bastard. Faithful or unfaithful, there was no way to avoid the storm dominating the horizon and surging closer and closer. Whipped into a frenzy, the wind gained momentum, and as the waves grew, our arc gained speed and altitude. Lightning illuminated the dark furrows of the storm clouds, and thunder overwhelmed our collective groan. A torrent of rain exploded on us, and as the waves propelled our vessel ever higher, the faithful prayed and the unfaithful cursed, but both wept. Then our arc reached its peak, and for an eternal moment, perched on the snow-capped crest of a watery precipice. Looking down on that deep wine-colored valley awaiting us, we were certain of two things. The first was that we were absolutely going to die. And the second was that we would almost certainly live. Yes, we were sure of it. We will live. And then we plunged howling into the abyss. So in The Committed, they make their way to France, which I think catches a lot of Americans by surprise, because I think Americans think, well, if you're fleeing from a communist country, you got to come to the United States. Well, that does happen in the first book, in The Sympathizer. And so the Sympathizer is a communist spy in the South Vietnamese army, and he flees with the remnants of that army in 1975 to the United States, where he's going to spy on their efforts to take their country back. And one thing he has to do to survive is to become an authenticity consultant on the making of a movie that looks suspiciously like Apocalypse Now. But if Francis Ford Coppola were to ask, it's not Apocalypse Now. Basically, I've seen, I think, almost all the movies that Hollywood has made about the Vietnam War, and it's an exercise I recommend to nobody, especially if you're Vietnamese. And so really the movie that they're going to be talking about in this scene is a compilation of the greatest hits of the American war movies on Vietnam. And so in this scene, our sympathizer is going to meet with the famous director of this movie, who's known only as the Auteur. And the movie they're talking about is called The Hamlet. And it's a movie about American Green Berets who are sent to Vietnam to train the so-called ethnic minorities or the so-called montagnards to defend themselves against communism. My meeting with the Auteur had gone on for a while longer, mostly in a more subdued fashion, with me pointing out that the lack of speaking parts for Vietnamese people in a movie set in Vietnam might be interpreted as cultural insensitivity. Do you not think it would be a little more believable, I said, a little more realistic, a little more authentic for a movie set in a certain country, for the people in that country to have something to say? Instead of having your screenplay direct, as it does now, cut to villagers speaking in their own language. Do you think it might not be decent to let them actually say something instead of simply acknowledging that there's some kind of sound coming from their mouths? Could you not even just have them speak a heavily accented English? You know what I mean, Ching Chong English, just to pretend they are speaking in an Asian language that somehow American audiences can strangely understand? The Auteur grimaced and said, "Very interesting. Great stuff. Loved it, but I had a question." "What was it?" I asked. "How many movies have you made?" "None." "Isn't that right?" "None. Zero. Zilch. Nada. Nothing. And however you say it in your language. So thank you for telling me how to do my job. Now get the hell out of my house and come back after you've made a movie or two. Maybe then I'll listen to one or two of your cheap ideas." And since the book came out, I've spoken to many Hollywood people, and none of them disagree with this representation. All right. I confess to being angry with the Auteur, but was I wrong in being angry? This was especially the case when he acknowledged he did not even know that Montagnard was simply a French catch-all term for the dozens of Highland minorities. What if, I said to him, I wrote a screenplay about the American West and simply called all the natives Indians? You'd want to know whether the cavalry was fighting the Navajo or Apache or Comanche, right? Likewise, I would want to know, when you say these people are Montagnards, whether we speak of the Bru or the Nung or the Tay. "Let me tell you a secret," the Auteur said. "You ready? Here it is. No one gives a shit." He was amused by my wordlessness. To see me without words is like seeing one of those Egyptian felines without hair, a rare and not necessarily desirable occasion. How could I be so dense? How could I be so deluded? I naively believed that I could divert the Hollywood organism from its goal, the simultaneous lobotomization and pickpocketing of the world's audiences. Hollywood did not just make horror movie monsters, it was its own horror movie monster, smashing me under its foot. I had failed, and the Auteur would make the Hamlet as he intended, with my countrymen serving merely as raw material for an epic about white men saving good yellow people from bad yellow people. I pitied the French for their naivete in believing they had to visit a country in order to exploit it. Hollywood was much more efficient imagining the countries it wanted to exploit. I was maddened by my helplessness before the Auteur's imagination and machinations. His arrogance marked something new in the world, for this was the first war where the losers would write history instead of the victors, courtesy of the most efficient propaganda machine ever created. With all due respect to Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis, who never achieved global domination. Hollywood's high priest understood innately the observation of Milton's Satan, that it was better to rule in hell than serve in heaven, better to be villain, loser, or anti-hero than virtuous extra, so long as one commanded the bright lights of center stage. In this forthcoming Hollywood trompe-l'oeil, all the Vietnamese of any side would come out poorly, herded into the roles of the poor the innocent, the evil, or the corrupt. Our fate was not to be merely mute. We were to be struck dumb. Thank you.
So when we were curating the series of public events, we immediately thought of Viet and Viet's work because his body of work attends to the question of migration with complexity, with rigor, with fearlessness, with compassion and wild imagination, and with a depth of perception quite rare and just simply moving to encounter. So Joe and I have come up with a set of questions that we hope will allow us to cover a wide range of topics. And, you know, questions we hope that will resonate with audience members who are just encountering and discovering Viet's work for the first time, or those of you who are intimately familiar with his writing. So with that little preamble, I'm going to turn it to Joe to get us started.
All right, I'll just begin by saying what a privilege it is actually to be here on the stage with Viet, my wonderful colleague Dag, and all of you. And this is the first time I've left my house in a long time. So yeah, it's a special honor to be here. So it's so striking, the movement from we to me to I in the committed. And I love that you read that opening we. And every one of these moves in your work entails an ending, which is sometimes quite dramatic. And even, you know, as you said, the end of the Sympathizer. So I'd love to hear about how you thought about sustaining this narrator, you know, especially across the break of the two novels, but then across these, you know, were you tempted at some of those endings in the committed to end? And also, this reading was magnificent because I was noticing just how fun, I mean, your books are so wry, but it was hilarious. So, you know, how to sustain that I too. I'd love to, you know, the tone of that too.
Well, sure. Thank you so much. And it's a real pleasure to be here with both of you and here at the Wolf Humanities Center. You know, we're all academics, right? And in my first life and still in my current life, sadly enough, I'm an academic. And academia is not known for a sense of humor, at least about itself. And no one who knew me before I wrote these novels would have thought Viet's a funny guy. You know, Viet's a pretty serious guy, you know. But like, you know, I basically grew up as a Vietnamese Catholic, which means I'm extremely repressed, still repressed. And academia just compounded that because academia is very repressed. And so what was really great about writing these novels was liberating that voice within myself. I think I'd always lurked there because I've long had a reputation as a smartass outside of academia. And here was my opportunity to try to bring that out and merge it with the critical voice of academics. You know, so everything that I've learned in academia in terms of critical theory and scholarship and research about the war and about literature and everything that we know, which is interesting to us, but not necessarily interesting to people outside of academia. I was able to try to sort of turn that into a fictional set of devices in these novels. And so that's where the humor comes from. I think my attempts to try to apply our critical thinking to really both situations that are both tragic and absurd, because that's what I think war and refugee experiences are. They're definitely tragedies, but they're also, if you have enough distance on them, absurd. You know, what's happening in Ukraine is absurd, but it's also horrifying and tragic all at the same time. So that's where, you know, I'd had to create a persona who could articulate all these things. And that's the I that opens up the Sympathizer. But as, you know, Jamal mentioned in the introduction, you know, at least one reviewer was kind enough to mention Whitman. And certainly, you know, having done doctoral studies that included reading Whitman, I was very aware of that idea that we contain multitudes. And that's, I think it's maybe that's true for all of us as individuals, right? But I think for those of us who happen to be so-called minorities of any kind, it's a very ironic situation to be in, because on the one hand, we are perceived by the so-called majority as being multitudinous, like there's too many of you out there, and at the same time, you're all the same, right? And so I wanted to create a character that was an embodiment of multitudes, and yet who would be completely uniquely singular. And so as his voice progressed, part of what happened was I just wanted to have fun. And so anytime this is also something different than my experiences in academia. In academia, I feel like I have to have a rational decision-making process for everything I do. In writing fiction, I say, what the fuck, I'm gonna do whatever I want. And I just give in to these impulses, and I say, well, now the I but maybe it should be you, maybe it should be we, and just give into that. But I think the intuition about that comes from this recognition that he does contain multitudes. He sees himself through his own eyes, but through the eyes of others. He sees himself as being an individual, but also as part of a collective. And in the end, he's also deeply, deeply traumatized. Both of these books are written retrospectively as confessions after he's been through a whole lot of stuff that has really messed him up. And so, you know, as a writer, what I'm trying to do is to try to express trauma through the writing without ever, I don't know if I ever actually used the word trauma, which an academic would say, this is trauma. That's what's happening in the novel. But as a fiction writer, that wouldn't be as fun. And then also he himself, as a writer who's writing a confession, is embodying that trauma without also ever being able to say that word. And so the shifts in pronouns are expressive of the damage that he's undergone and these multiple personas that he has.
Well, another thing that kind of struck us about The Committed is the way in which friendship, especially between the narrator and Bond, moves the plot forward, and moreover becomes a key means to explore the very idea of commitment. And you know, from the Sympathizer to The Committed, we've seen how the narrator protagonist's political allegiances waver, they change, but his fidelity to the bonds of friendship seem inviolable, sacrosanct. So we're wondering, you know, can you say more about the kind of the uses and the prerogative of friendship when all these ideals like communism, like falter, but the commitment to friendship remains, you know, consistently throughout these two novels?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, I'll give you an anecdote. You know, I came as a refugee to the United States when I was 4, and I went to a public school initially with a lot of Vietnamese students, all refugees, of course. But by the 2nd grade, we were already forming our own gangs in the schoolyard. I mean, we didn't do any damage. We just sort of kicked and flailed at each other harmlessly. They did. I'm a coward. So I stood in the back of my little gang. But that was my first introduction to this idea that brotherhood and friendship, because they're all boys, is super important to Vietnamese refugees, Vietnamese boys, Vietnamese men. And certainly that was the world that I grew up in, a world that was very gender divided, where men had their roles and women had their roles. And when it came to young men and older men, filiality, brotherhood, willing to die for your fellow friends or gang members or whatever was super important. That was part of the mythology of Vietnamese masculinity that I think is really there in Vietnamese culture, but it certainly was aggravated by the war and by the fact that, you know, most men had to go off and join the army and be drafted. And I also was a fan of John Woo movies, and John Woo movies are all about the same thing, this hyper masculine fraternal brotherhood, and these manly bonds are more important even than the bonds between presumably heterosexual men and women. So that was the persona that I created, for better and for worse. You know, I wanted to create a first-person narrator who was a spy, who was a sort of this bad James Bond, who could be the sexy Asian dude, because, you know, I grew up with the generation, you know, I gotta say, you know, Asian men have to let this go, but, you know, I grew up in this generation where a lot of Asian American men were like, we are emasculated and, you know, all this kind of, you know, really kind of, I mean, it's partly true, but also kind of pathetic at the same time, this sort of hang up. And so I did want to at least put a strong Asian heterosexual masculine character in the center of it. This had some benefits and some drawbacks. The benefits are, as you say, this focus on brotherhood and on brotherhood for revolution, which also has Chinese roots as well, in Chinese mythologies. And so that's where a lot of the drama comes from, that as terrible as as my Sympathizer is, sometimes I get reminded, people say, he's kind of not a nice person, you know, he's an alcoholic, he's a liar, he's a murderer, he's a spy, he's a womanizer. All that is true. And yet I like him. And part of the reason why I like him is because he believes in things. He believes in his ideology, he believes in his revolution, he believes in principles, and he believes in friendship and loyalty above all else. And that's where the drama comes from, because what happens when your commitment to one set of principles, in this case, revolution, comes into conflict with another set of principles, friendship, and your friends end up on different sides. This is great drama, and it's also real history, because it's happened to a lot of people in Vietnam, and I'm sure in other countries as well, where your friendships or your blood ties were different than your political allegiances. And the drawbacks are that I created a very masculine narrator who's also a misogynist.
Right.
We can talk about that too. But anyway, you know, as a fiction writer, not as an academic, I had to pursue the creation of this character to his logical ends, for better and for worse.
Yeah, I like that you established that academia is not fun.
Am I wrong?
No,
If there's graduate students out there, it's a lot of fun. Yeah, a lot of fun.
but you know, but fiction writing, but fiction is fun, you know. And I think like even your responses, like the thinking about that friendship. I mean, theorizing friendship, no fun. You know, the politics of friendship, you know, but the way it comes to life is so fun. But back to your point about how academia is not fun. You know, but you actually kind of answered my question about why it is you have this material that's very familiar to us as academics in your novels. And so this, it really struck me in The Committed because the location to Paris seemed to me to be an opportunity for you to engage with, you know, Marxism, French Marxism, post-structuralism from the Telkel group, and most importantly, post-colonial thinkers writing in French. And so, you know, to think of, I mean, you've kind of answered this already, but you know, the space of fiction as a place to kind of play out these theoretical scenes in these stages. So, but what did France give you for the, and that kind of the French edge to that theory?
Well, you know, The Sympathizer, I think, is a very theoretical novel, but the theory is all mostly submerged, right, into the way the book is constructed and the way that it talks about certain kinds of issues. So you don't need any theory to read The Sympathizer, even though there's a lot of it in there. But in The Committed, I thought I'm going to go to France, and partly I wanted to go to France because I already offended everybody else in The Sympathizer, so now it's a French term. And then I also, you know, wanted to confront my own mental colonization under French culture. You know, for example, you know, my parents were born in the 1930s. My father's still alive, but he had a French education. And even at 88 years old, 88 years of age, he can still remember some of the French songs that he had to sing from that period. He'll torture me with that over dinner, the same song every time I go home to see him. And I feel like even though I didn't grow up under French colonization officially, I grew up under the shadow of French colonization as a Vietnamese person, and has had a big impact on me because its traces, French colonization's traces, are everywhere in Vietnamese culture, from the language to the food and so on. And in a sense, I think we've all been colonized by the French, just as you know, most of the world has been mentally colonized by Americans. This is what imperial power means. I grew up as an Anglophile, for example, because we've all been mentally colonized by British imperialism, and then French imperialism and American imperialism. So The Committed is really, I think, explicitly about taking on French colonization, but with the understanding that, of course, American colonization is present, and this book is written in English, so British imperialism is present as well. And I thought that in The Committed, he's going to go to France, and part of my stereotype about the French is that they're all intellectuals. And you know, so it was really heartening to go to France and going to Monoprix, which is like their Target, right? And going to the book section in Monoprix and realizing the French like to read trash too, contrary to the popular export of the ideas of French intellectuals. But then I did a French book fest. Then The Committed was released in France, and I did an event, and the interviewer was like, you know, we French love our authors and our intellectuals and our ideas. So that is still a really present idea. And so The Committed is a thriller. There's lots of sex and drugs and violence and all this kind of wonderful stuff. I think one reviewer described the novel as a cross between Quentin Tarantino and Jean-Paul Sartre. I like that.
Yeah.
I like that description.
Yeah.
But then it's also a novel of ideas. And for me, like, ideas are thrilling. Ideas are thrilling, and ideas are enormously impactful. It could be hard in the American context because it's such an anti-intellectual culture in some ways that Americans have, which is why when The Committed came out, I try not to read the reviews, but a couple snuck past me, and they said, you know, there are too many ideas in this book. It's like reading it's like being in a graduate seminar. I'm like, no, it's like being in an undergraduate seminar. It's not like being in a graduate seminar. But you know, ironically, I did read some of the French reviews, and they don't seem put off by the ideas at all. So it reaffirms my stereotype of the French. But I did, as you said, wanted in this novel to have our sympathizer question all of his assumptions. In the Sympathizer, he is beginning to question what it means to have a revolution, for example, what it means to be a communist. And then in the committed, he has to go even further into it to ask questions about what does it mean to have a violent revolution versus a nonviolent revolution? These are questions that preoccupy me. And to, and part of the conceit of the committed is that it's not just professors and graduate students who have these conversations. It's like other people have these conversations, right? I mean, is it so weird that a bouncer in a brothel, this is what happens in the committed, would be reading Frantz Fanon?
That's right.
And I'm like, well, why not? I mean, revolutions have been fomented in prisons, in brothels, in places where people do not hold academic degrees. And, I wanted to foreground that idea that, again, there's an intersection between ideas and political movements and personal movements and people's everyday lives, not just academic lives.
I was immediately thinking of that one character as you were talking, and the kind of spectacular appearance that he has at like these key moments. Yeah, it is thrilling. Well, it's way more fun than a grad seminar.
Well, just to follow up on that, so people could glean this just reading your fiction, the way in which you are versed in philosophy and critical theory, and so on and so forth. But just maybe to you've written novels, short stories, a children's book I actually haven't read with your son, but I can't wait to read, personal essays, opinion pieces, academic scholarship, right? And your work reminds us how other creative writers, and for me at least immediately, Toni Morrison's work, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o's work come to mind, of creative writers who are also producing scholarship to intervene in the academy, right? So we wanted to, just hear you reflect more about how you approach writing in multiple genres, but also this, engagement and intervention within how to reorient our scholarship in the academy.
Honestly, when I was a little boy and then through high school, I never wanted to be a professor. I didn't know what that meant. What is a professor? My parents, my dad had a high school education. My mom had a grade school education. My brother was the first one, as far as I know, in our entire family history, extended family, to graduate from college. And I was possibly the second. And so I wanted to be a writer when I was a kid, and when I went to Berkeley for college, I didn't see how that was possible, initially. It was hard enough. My parents were refugee shopkeepers. I mean, how am I going to go home to my parents and say, Mom and Dad, I want to be a writer. Mom and Dad, I want to study Jane Austen and the Romantics. And it's very, very difficult to say. And so going to Berkeley really saved my life in a lot of ways, totally transformed me intellectually, politically, personally, emotionally. And it gave me the language to call myself an Asian American. And I began to read more than Jane Austen and the Romantics. I mean, I love Jane Austen and the Romantics. There's no problem with that, but at Berkeley, I also began to read Asian American literature and African American literature, Chicano literature, Native American literature, anti-colonial and post-colonial literature, and encountered people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Toni Morrison and many, many others. And finally, I could connect the idea of being a writer with my life. Like it was not something separate anymore. Like I could, whether or not my parents would ever read my work, and I don't expect them to, I could at least write about my parents' lives and people like them. And I, at Berkeley, really fell in love with this idea that writers and scholars could make a difference. And that was what allowed me to continue on to graduate school, because if I couldn't make that connection, I'm like, well, I can just go to law school instead. And so when I applied for graduate school, for my doctoral program, my statement of purpose was, literary criticism can change the world. That was my passion, though. That's what I believed in. And I also believed that writing could change the world. But I wasn't good enough to be a writer, so I had to become a professor first, get tenure, and then never be fired again, right? And I could do exactly what I wanted. It's too late for anybody to do anything about it. That was the plan. And so for me, it was always first and foremost about the writing. And then I accidentally became a scholar. And then I wrote my first academic book, which none of you need to read, because I've never reread it. And I thought at the end of it, this is what I've been training for 10 years to do, and I can't stand it. I can't stand it. When I started graduate school, I wanted to write like a conventional academic because I really admired what they do, and I still do. But by the end of it, writing that first book, I thought, if I have to write another book like this, I have to quit academia, because I found it personally to be soul killing, because it was so repressive. And the writing was not fun for me. It could be for other people. So if you like writing that kind of thing, more power to you. We need it. But I couldn't do it any longer. And so I had to save myself as a writer if I wanted to save myself as an academic. And what that meant is that I had to find a way to make writing fun for myself again. And that meant giving into intuition, giving into impulse, breaking through the repression, and finding the emotion in the writing. And that's what fiction allowed me to do after a very long struggle, trying to figure out how to do those kinds of things in fiction. And then that allowed me then to go back to academic writing. So I wrote a second academic book called Nothing Ever Dies. And I wrote that in the year after The Sympathizer came out. And what happened was that when The Sympathizer came out, I went on book tour. I met all kinds of people I'd never met before, including booksellers. And I was talking to these booksellers. I was describing Nothing Ever Dies to them, and they seemed interested. And I thought, this is actually who I want to reach. I mean, it would be great if academics read this book, but I really also want to reach intelligent people who are not academics, which could include undergraduate students, would include civilians, veterans, booksellers. And I'm happy to say that that seems to be what has happened, because Nothing Ever Dies is very serious work of, philosophy and criticism and all that kind of stuff. But it's also, I hope, a work that's interesting to read for non-specialists. And so I get messages from people who are not academics saying, hey, this book has really been meaningful. And that's been so meaningful to me, because it affirms my conviction that what we do as academics actually really does matter. I believe our scholarship and criticism and theory really does matter. And obviously it matters for academics, but could some of us at least make an effort to try to make that clear to non-academics? So we need Judith Butler, we need Gertrude Spivak, we need Lisa Loeb. They've never compromised on what they've done, and they've demonstrated that ideas and theory can shift the world. But then we need people like you and me, and I don't know if you're also writing creative nonfiction, but we need people like us to also demonstrate that academics can write in other ways as well. So that's what's happened. And in terms of my writing practice, it's simply my belief that, again, I'm a writer first and foremost, and everything else is sort of a different guise that I wear, whether it's the novelist or an essayist or a scholar or a public opinion writer or whatever. So when I always have multiple projects going on. So as soon as I'm stuck on one thing, I'll switch to another. There's always another project. That's one tip for those of you who are writers. If you have writer's block, have another writing project, and so you can always switch to something else. And when you finish a writing project, give yourself one day to celebrate and then get started writing again. That's what I do, because sometimes I think, well, I see some writers, they publish a book, they don't do anything for another 10 or 20 years. And there's many reasons for that. But one reason could be they don't have another project lined up. So I'm always trying to think ahead to the next thing. And also, finally, last thing, I really do think of my writing as being committed, as the title of that novel goes, to a worldview. In which all the writing is there to address different aspects of that worldview. Here it's war and refugees and colonialism from different angles. And the belief is I can do that one way in fiction, and I can do that another way writing for the New York Times.
You've kind of answered my next question, because we were interested in the guises that you've just talked about. But I think the committed is interesting because that book in particular feels like a multi-genre work. And I'm just how you feel moving between genres. And again, from your reading, the voice in the committed is so different from your short stories, and so I'm interested in kind of the satiric form of the novel, what that affords you. But yeah, just more about how you're, inhabiting these different guises.
So, the way that I became a writer was to write The Refugees. It's a collection of short stories. It took me 17 years to write. And if I'd known that at the beginning, I never would have written that book. It was like almost every moment of it was horrible. But by not giving up, I became a writer. I mean, that's actually the most important lesson for me when I look back upon myself, like my career. No one who read my writing when I was 19 would have thought Viet has any talent. Backseat on Kingston gave me a B+. That's the Asian F. Okay, so no one thought I was going to be a writer. That's the Asian F. That's the Asian F. She knew she was giving me the Asian F. She knew she was giving me that. But I persisted. I persisted, and I think that's the key to me for being a writer. Like ignore what everybody else's opinion about your work may be, including your own, and just keep writing. And maybe, and I guarantee you, if you try for 20 years and do 10,000 hours, you'll be a writer. I can't say what kind of writer you'll become, but you'll be a writer. So I learned how to be a writer by writing these short stories. And if you read the short stories, I think they're pretty good, but they're also pretty conventional in the realist short fiction. And that's what's popular in the United States, at least when it comes to short stories. And I felt like when I was writing that book that I was writing for me partly, but I was also self-conscious. I was writing for editors, agents, publishers, and I was writing for Vietnamese people. Like, what are Vietnamese people going to think? Because this is supposed to be a book about Vietnamese voices representing Vietnamese people in a world that where when we say Vietnam, people mean the Vietnam War, right? So I wrote that book, and then before it could even, we couldn't sell it. And so my agent said, why don't you write a novel? I said, fine, I'm going to write a novel.
Wow.
And I thought, I've just spent 17 years of my life trying to please other people. I'm going to write this novel for me, which is not something your agent or your editor wants to hear. They want you to write for an audience and for multitudes and all that. But for me, the big psychological and artistic breakthrough was to decide I'm going to write for me, first and foremost. And that's what happened. And it's like that moment in Karate Kid, wax on, wax off. This is going to go over the heads of some of you, but wax on, wax off. What you just do these repetitive exercises that has nothing to do with karate, and then all of a sudden one day, wow, you have this amazing skill. And I felt that's what happened with the Sympathizer. I never tried to write a novel before, and I just was able to do it. But really, I think what's important for me to say about the Sympathizer is that it's a novel that is written completely and purely out of my passions and out of my refusal to heed the expectations of others. For example, I knew that if I would change the novel in certain ways, it would be more acceptable to these editors and these agents. The novel was rejected by 13 out of 14 publishers. I had one conversation. Only one editor even wanted to talk to me. So we had a conversation. He said, love the book, but maybe you should do a couple of things to it. And this editor I knew could give 6-figure advances. And I thought, but I don't want to do this. And one of the things he asked me to do, and goes back to your earlier question, he said, so who is, I think our narrator should have a relationship with somebody. And by that, I think he meant like a romantic relationship, because that editor, his author, had just won the Pulitzer Prize for Orphan Master's Son, which is, if you've read it, kind of similar to the Sympathizer, except it crosses Casablanca with a spy narrative in North Korea. Okay? And I thought, I don't want to write that kind of a book. I know it's more crowd appealing. Everybody wants to see the romantic story, whatever. And I said, well, he's definitely having a relationship with himself. Editor was not happy to hear that. Okay, well, he's also having a relationship with Bond, his best friend, who he's going to betray. He didn't want to hear that either. So that's where the fraternal thing becomes so important, because that is where his commitment is. It's not to women or heteronormative stuff, for better or for worse. It's towards men and towards himself. But it was a novel that was it was to me so important that it was about himself and his own internal agonies and this internal monologue that he's having. So for me, the lesson to take away from this is, whatever, if there are writers out there and you have your particular projects and so on, whatever it is, stay true to your passion, to your conviction, even when people are telling you that this is not what they want to hear. That's their problem, not yours. So I'm not guaranteeing that you're going to get published, but what I'm saying is that part of what it meant for me to become a writer is to know who I am, what I wanted to say, what my voice is, and to stick with it.
Maybe to kind of change gears a bit, we couldn't have anticipated, the war in Ukraine, but of course your work is so timely and so apt in thinking about so much of what's happening in the contemporary world, and not just in Ukraine, right? Wars are raging all over the world, including in my own native Ethiopia, that's been engaged in war for a year and change. But we thought just to hear you reflect on what you see, what's transpiring in Ukraine. And we ask in part because we know, Joe and I were talking, and the Vietnam War as the kind of war represented on TV, and more than the Iraq war, this is something. It's almost like a reality TV that it's on our social media. It's not just about the war. As you read the excerpt from the Sympathizer, it's also about its representation. So, from your vantage point, how are you thinking about the war?
Well, I think that whatever country we find ourselves in, there's this kind of a tension between short-term memory and long-term memory. That nations want to impose this very ideological long-term memory on us, like the American dream, for example, and that substitutes for the short-term memory. So, for example, when we look at Ukraine, one of the things that seems to be happening is that everybody's short-term memory, or many people's short-term memory, has vanished. Like everybody just forgot about Afghanistan. Everybody forgot about Iraq. Everybody forgot about Syria. So here we have the United States going in and saying, "Hey, terrible Russia, do it." And I agree. We should be opposed to Russian imperialism, Russian invasion of Ukraine. We should stand with Ukrainian people and citizens and civilians. But if we're opposed to a big country invading a weaker country, we should be opposed to that whenever it's happening, including when we're doing it, and we do it very, very often. And that's what I mean by the fact that long-term memory substitutes for short-term memory. We have a very easy to use, highly deployable American dream narrative in our media that gets put in here, and it compels people to totally forget what we ourselves as a country has done and to focus on this partly media-driven creation about what Ukraine symbolizes. So on the one hand, there's an actual geopolitical thing that's going on in Ukraine, and then there's the media and ideological narrative that happens. And I think, my job and our job is, as critics, as scholars, as writers, is to try to remind people about these narratives that are taking place and remind people about the things they've just forgotten that they were concerned about, like literally last year.
Right.
And so people are right to say, well, what did the United States do in Afghanistan? What is the United States doing in supporting Israel in Palestine? I mean, these are the things that we have to do to kind of remind people. And there's so many ways in which I think that is manifest. Other kinds of media narratives. For example, right now there's a lot of anti-Asian violence that's taking place, and a lot of the response to this anti-Asian violence is, I think, very, very short-term memory driven. People are just saying, well, it's horrible. It's obviously horrible that Asians are being beaten up and murdered for whatever reason. But I like to say, the greatest acts of anti-Asian violence that have been perpetrated have been American wars in Asia. And we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the fact that millions of Asians have died as a result of American wars in Asia. And so, yes, it's important to talk about dozens and hundreds and thousands of incidents of anti-Asian violence here in the United States. But let's contextualize it. Let's link it to this larger history that we would rather forget.
Well, on to one of the failings of our short-term memory. We're especially interested in our recent retreat from Afghanistan, and so much of that coverage, the reporters are saying, "Oh, this is Saigon 1975." The connections were made so directly in Afghanistan. So I wondered how you felt then with that coverage, and then there's a very different response to refugees between Afghanistan and Ukraine, and how red tape is falling away for Ukrainian refugees, and that those triple layer, multiple layers of red tape that those refugees were not able to surmount. So I'd love to hear you respond to that.
Well, obviously, I think we should be taking in all Ukrainian refugees. That's absolutely the right thing to do. But if we do that, then we should be taking in all refugees, period. And that is part of what I think of as what I want to try to argue constantly. So I'm constantly repeating myself that this is what we need to do, and that obviously we don't take in all refugees everywhere at every time, because the treatment of refugees is highly, highly politicized. So on the one hand, I have deep empathy for Ukrainian refugees, and at the same time, I'm deeply aware that this is a political crisis, a political narrative of empathy for Ukrainian refugees that isn't extended to other populations. And it should be. So going back to the Kabul and Afghanistan example, when that was taking place, obviously these are very historically different kinds of situations, so we can't conflate the two. But there's some parallels. And for me, and for a lot of other Vietnamese refugees, former refugees, when we were seeing what was happening in Kabul and Afghanistan, I think a lot of us felt this does feel very similar in at least one or two ways to what was happening to the Vietnamese people, the South Vietnamese people, and what was happening in Saigon at that time. And I felt that it was our obligation to try to draw attention to that. And I'm really proud of some of my fellow Vietnamese refugees for not only drawing attention to that, but for participating in refugee resettlement programs as well. But what is there to draw attention to? It's partly the fact that the images are similar, obviously, of desperate people trying to get their way out of these countries. But what's also similar is American overreach. The fact that American overreach in both of these countries was due to an American unwillingness to understand the situations that they were getting involved in. So retrospectively, after the end of the war in Vietnam, so many Americans who participated in that war were saying, we wish we had studied Vietnam a little bit better before we got involved, which can be said for every situation that Americans have gotten themselves involved in, including Afghanistan. And yet after every situation, Americans don't actually learn that they should be learning more before they get involved, or that they shouldn't be getting involved at all.
I'm curious. I mean, something seems to have shifted in the past few years. When you look at American politics, where you look at, the COVID pandemic, global politics, I wonder if since we are entering a new kind of historical era, or, and it's global, you go anywhere, and kind of, ethno-nationalism going wild, wars, more coups d'etats, for instance, on the African continent in the past 2 years than the last 30, 40 years. So this is something that we see in the United States and in relief around the world. So I wonder if you sense, something is shifting, as maybe in a kind of a epochal shift. I'm not sure. I don't know how you see it.
Your opinion is as good as mine on this one, but obviously I think there are things that are new political crises, new actors, new national powers, and so on. But I also think of history as being cyclical and repetitive, because history is being generated from the same set of contradictions that have been there for a very long time. So for me, my frame of reference is colonialism, and specifically European colonialism, settler colonialism, this time frame that we've been living in for the last half millennia, that has shaped and defined national identities, racial relations domestically here in the United States, great power contests, and what we're seeing in terms of tensions between Russia, China, the United States. Yes, they may be new, but they're also expressions of these imperial struggles and their consequences that have been taking place before. And on the one hand, thinking about things in this way is really daunting, to think, wow, this has been going on for at least half a millennia, and we're still in the age of colonialism and its consequences. On the other hand, I find it very empowering, because this gives me a language to try to understand why certain things are happening today. So again, going back to this example of anti-Asian violence, it's happening again because the contradictions that have brought Asian immigrants and refugees to the United States beginning in the 18th century are there because of colonialism, because of the needs of capitalism, because of Europe and the United States' orientation towards the Asia as the Oriental other. All those things are happening. So that helps me to talk to, for example, college-age students, because I do this a lot. I go around to a lot of college campuses, and often, a theme that gets repeated by a lot of college students is, we're undergoing still identity crises, East-West tensions, generational clashes, et cetera, et cetera. This is what we were undergoing 30 years ago when I was in college. And that's depressing in some ways, but it's also really predictable, because what it tells me is that this generation has boba and BTS, and therefore everything should be cool. That's more than we ever had when I was growing up. But it's not cool, because the systemic contradictions of capitalism, exploitation, colonialism, violence, boba and BTS is not going to cure that. Those are cultural solutions to a geopolitical crisis that's been going on for half a millennia. So if we understand what the larger frame of the problem is, then these seemingly new phenomena, like, Korean wave pop culture is going to save the world for Asians. No, it's not. Korean wave pop culture is born out of Korean sub-imperialism. I mean, South Korea was a country that was poorer than Vietnam was in the 1950s and 1960s because it had been demolished during the Korean War. And then the United States basically hired 300,000 South Korean troops to come fight in South Vietnam and hired South Korean corporations to help build the American war effort in South Vietnam. And this helped to set the stage for South Korean economic expansion, which eventually culminates in the Korean wave and BTS, right? So if we understand that, I think that gives us a completely different way of understanding our present versus simply saying, wow, it's awesome that everybody wants to have a Korean hairstyle now.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many dangers to what we, are longing for representation without really thinking through redistribution. This is this problematic that you're bringing up. And I think you are obviously such an eloquent speaker. I feel personally proud of you in Asian American Studies to have you in our field, to be able to speak in this way with this passion. But Dag and I were talking about this, about kind of the responsibilities that you have as a speaker, and for representing. And, I think a lot of us had a taste of that with the anti-Asian violence. Like, I had no interest in but, we all had to do a little bit of it. So how have you shouldered that responsibility, which you're doing right now, and how do you feel about it?
Ambivalent, highly ambivalent. It's very clear to me that I'm the professional Vietnamese, professional Asian American, not the first of my kind. It was Hanif Qureshi, I think, who coined the term professional Pakistani in the Buddha of suburbia. So this plight or this situation of the representative, the spokesperson, and so on, the voice for the voiceless, all that kind of stuff that's imposed on us in situations where we happen to be the so-called minority, whatever country that is a burden. And it's not a burden that's placed upon people of the so-called majority for the most part. And so it's a burden. It's a burden that I feel like I can't not take on, but it's one that I have to take on very self-consciously and that I have to draw attention to constantly, because there are a lot of people who are unself-conscious about this. In one of the reviews that Jamal quoted, I think mine was described as giving voice to the voiceless. when I read that, I was like, I knew it was coming. I knew it was coming, because that is in fact exactly what you're talking about. This idea that whenever you have this hot new young voice, even though it was an old voice by the time that book came out, when you have this hot new voice from a so-called minority population, the so-called majority would say, "Oh, there's a voice for the voiceless. Let's talk about this person for 6 months until we get the next voice for the voiceless." So I'm very self-conscious about that dynamic, and yet I'm also very aware that I should exploit that, because why not? So I'll give you an example. I finished the Sympathizer in 2014. All the edits were done by 2014. But I told my editor, let's delay publication until 2015. You know why? Because that's the 40th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. Let's publish this in April 2015. And I was absolutely right. I got so much attention because people were like, oh, here's a voice for the voiceless, exactly when we need it. And you could say that's ruthless, commercial, crass self-exploitation. That's true. But it was also my attempt to seize the mic at that moment. I did 30 interviews in 30 days. And I didn't do those 30 interviews simply to say, I'm awesome. I did those 30 interviews to say a lot of the things that I'm saying now, because I feel like this is our dilemma. Like we can walk away from this burden because we don't want to subscribe to other people's expectations, or we can try to run directly into it and try to take control. And that's what I want to do. So writing The Sympathizer, for example, I knew that was the novel that people expected me to write. Hey, you're Vietnamese, you should be writing about Vietnamese topics. And then on the other hand, publishers were saying, well, we don't want to read another Vietnam War novel. We're sick and tired of Vietnam War novels. What kind of a dilemma is that? So I said, I'm going to write a Vietnam War novel, but I'm going to write it my way, which is the way that Americans have not been writing it, and the way that Vietnamese people have not been writing it. So I think that's our challenge. Again, going back to this idea of colonialism and cyclic repetitions, the dilemma that I'm facing is not new. It was happening 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, right? The dilemma is not new. Our obligation as writers, thinkers, intellectuals, just people who are going to go home and have conversations with mom and dad and the family and so on, our obligation is to understand the larger history, the larger cycles, the stereotypes that we're facing, and try to figure out a way to do something creative and new that will destroy both inhabit and destroy those stereotypes at the same time. So I did write the Vietnam War novel, but I wrote it on my own terms. But I also felt like I could not write the Vietnam War novel, because if I didn't do it, I'd leave the territory open to everybody else to write these things that I totally disagree with. So that's a challenge that I think I have as a professional Vietnamese and professional Asian American and now professional refugee. You know, it's like it's not a great position to be in, but I have to take advantage of it, because if I don't, someone else whose opinions I might disagree with might be saying things that I don't think is giving the right kind of analysis.
Yeah, you said earlier that you generally work on multiple things. What should we expect soon? What are what's the project? What are the projects that you are, you know, in the midst of, preoccupied with, excited by?
Terrified by writing a memoir. So I'm doing that. Hopefully it'll be done by the end of the summer. Never thought I'd write about myself and my family, but I've only been able to do it in the context of everything we've been talking about, and, you know, talking about our lives in the context of the history that shaped us and brought us here. That's what makes it interesting for me. And then I got to write the third and final novel of the Sympathizer trilogy. There will be no more than 3 novels. And let me say, it's really hard for me to say that, because HBO is adapting the Sympathizer for TV. So I should want to write 10 novels. So then it just, like, you know, it just goes on forever, but it's going to be 3. And so, yes, that's the other thing is.
This is breaking news. You heard it here first.
Reading the scripts right now for the Sympathizer TV series adaptation. The last thing I'll say here is when we're talking about representation and we're talking about structural change and power and things like that, it was really great for me to see, number one, that the book was optioned by a Canadian producer. I think Americans are totally screwing me on this one. So we have a Canadian producer, we have a Korean director, Park Chan-wook, whose work was actually very inspirational for me. Old Boy was a major influence for the Sympathizer. Watch the Korean version, not the American remake. Like I said, Americans will screw you, right? So Park Chan-wook, and then because Park Chan-wook's one of his great ideas, and he's, you know, it was really impressive to talk to him for a while, because he clearly read the novel, which is not always the case for certain people. And he had these great questions. And I thought, why weren't you here when I was writing the novel? I could really have used these suggestions. And then one of his suggestions, and it's going to happen since he's a director, is that we'll cast one white guy to play all the white guy roles.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
And that's Robert Downey Jr. So, and I mean, like my son, he's 8 years old. He's like, so Iron Man is going to be in a TV series, you know, and, you know, we're talking about ruthless, crass commercial exploitation. If it gets more people to watch the TV series, then that's great. Everybody else will be Vietnamese, I think, in there. But the last thing is, I met the writer's room. And this is the stuff that happens behind the scenes. And so it's really crucial that in the writer's room, there's 2 white male writers, and everybody else is an Asian or Asian American woman and 1 black man. And I thought, that's the kind of writer's room that we need to see. That's the kind of metaphor for how we get to control our own narratives and get to control our own stories. It's not that we're the faces on the screen, you know, that's one version of representation, but the other version of representation is being able to control the narrative as well. Now, we're still far from that because we don't control HBO, but at least we have this writer's room.
Thank you for sharing that. Shall we open it up? We have about 15 minutes. We have to wrap up by 6:30. So we turn it to you all. Please don't be shy. Questions? I think there's a question right in the center. Actually, please wait for the mic.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. I really loved reading The Sympathizer, I think when it first came out, but my question was about an event that's actually happening tomorrow in this same room. The director of Crazy Rich Asians is coming to speak. And I was wondering, since we talked a lot about representation in media, I was wondering, and it's like very clearly a very different genre of film than this, but it still is related to Asian representation in big filmmaking. I was curious what your thoughts were on how, I guess, the 2 like work together, like the types of narratives that you are writing and then will later be adapted into film, and versus the types of narratives that that film and ones like that portray, and what you think are kind of the pros and cons of each, and also like how they work together to portray a more well-rounded view of Asians and Asian Americans.
I have to admit to being a bad Asian. I haven't seen Crazy Rich Asians. I know that was all of our moral obligation to rush out there and watch the movie, but I have not been able to bring myself to do that. Not a knock on anything. I did read the book. So, you know, and by Kevin Kwan, which I thought was entertaining. And I think the point here is that there's room enough, or there should be room enough for all of us to tell these kinds of stories. You know, the term that I've come up with is narrative plenitude. You know, we should have the opportunity to tell any kind of story that we want versus saying, oh, you're Vietnamese, you got to write the Vietnam War story. Well, I would have loved to write the story about crazy rich Vietnamese people too. And that would have been the House of Ho. You have the House of Ho. I don't know how many people have seen the House of Ho, you know? And the point is that, yeah, it's great that we have so-called serious stuff like the Sympathizer and the whole history of Asian American documentary. And it's great that we have Crazy Rich Asians and the House of Ho, because, you know, I believe in an America where everyone has the right to be equal, which means everyone has the right to be mediocre, right? So we don't all have, and again, not a knock on Crazy Rich Asians. What I'm saying is we don't all have to aspire to be, you know, whatever is seen as the elite thing in our respective fields. We should have the freedom to fail, to be mediocre, to do things that other Asians may not like, right? And that is an expression of freedom, right? And the fact that we as so-called minorities don't have that kind of full freedom of representational freedom, of feeling that we have a burden, or that people are always looking at us judgmentally, whether it's our own people or whether it's people of other populations. This is an index for social and economic inequality in general. Okay, so that's why I'm saying that when we talk about representation and representation mattering, yes, obviously it's important. It's important we have BTS. It's important we have Crazy Rich Asians. But in the end, those are also limited versions of the kind of representation that I'm interested in. I'm interested in, you know, redistribution as a form of representation. You know, do we have genuine equality for all kinds of people through all kinds of apparatuses and industries and so on? We're very, very far away from having that happen. So support Crazy Rich Asians and then get to work, you know, expanding the fields and the possibilities for all of us in different places.
Hi, I had a question. I loved everything you were saying about the role Hollywood, and this is another Hollywood question, plays in perpetuating both like the short and long-term memory pieces. And it feels like we're in this moment of like a weird cycle, especially around anti-CRT, other things where everything is the short-term narrative and not the long. And, you know, you talked about Apocalypse Now, you talked about those kind of war movies, but how do you conceptualize other parts of Hollywood that aren't war movies and how they perpetuate the short-term narrative and undercut the possibility for long-term narrative to be more disruptive, right?
Yeah, you know, the way I think about it is that Hollywood is, I think, probably our most expensive art form. You know, it takes tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to produce TV shows and movies. And therefore, it's probably the art form that's the most difficult to change, especially in an ideological way. Whereas poetry is the cheapest. You know, it just costs a poet's life, that's all it costs, you know, which is why when it comes to things like war, oftentimes poets among artists are the first ones to speak out through their art form. And filmmakers are oftentimes, at least cinematic, you know, narrative Hollywood filmmakers are oftentimes the last to speak out on these kinds of issues. And so I don't really have an easy answer to your question. It's related to this question of representation, the way that Hollywood is invested in representation is representation superficially. Well, you know, let's make sure we have diverse actors and all that kind of thing. But what does it mean when you have diverse actors telling the same kind of story? So is it any better if, you know, we have war narratives, let's say, if we go down this road, war narratives that are multicultural? Okay, so is it better that we have a Black soldier in the story versus a white soldier? You know, it depends on how that story is being told. But oftentimes the formula of the story, the ideological underpinnings of the story don't change that much. And so that's what we should really be paying attention to. It's not that we should dismiss Hollywood, because the times when Hollywood does work, it's really very powerful. And that's why when the news broke about HBO adapting The Sympathizer with Park Chan-wook, there was a lot of social media reaction. People were very excited because I think obviously they understand that even a bad TV series, I'm not saying it's going to be bad, but even a bad TV series will get millions of viewers, and even a very good or excellent book would be lucky to get tens of thousands of readers. So the impact that Hollywood has is tremendous as part of its ideological, economic, political function. So we should try to change that as much as we can, but it's so enormously difficult to do that. So I don't think we should be investing all of our energies into that. But I know a few people in the Hollywood film industry who are Asian Americans and so on, and more power to them that they're doing their best to try to change things incrementally, because pop culture obviously has a seismic impact globally, and people will watch these things all over the world, as they have with Vietnam War movies from the United States. So, you know, that was brought home to me by the fact that wherever I go in this world, people will have seen Apocalypse Now. Even people who are opposed to American imperialism will have seen Apocalypse Now. And so it's just another cultural front that we have to be fighting on.
Thank you for being here, and for how generous you've been in engaging our questions and discussing your work. I have to say, I have read most, if not all, of your fiction and nonfiction, and really appreciate, as an academic, among the things that haven't been said, the way that you have been bridging what have been separate worlds of, or for too long, artificially separate worlds of Asian studies and Asian American studies. And that's not what my comment was. My comment, or my question to you, is to say, well, maybe it is a comment. I don't know if you'd want to speak about it, but that I've been extremely moved by your intervention and your advocacy on behalf of writers, in terms of creative writing, and in terms of the thousands, not the millions, on the pages of the New York Times and elsewhere, in terms of thinking about why does literary fiction, the field of literary fiction, look the way it does? Not just about getting the agent, but, you know, why is this Palestinian writer not being heard? And where is the space for political novels? And you've made that argument through The Committed, of course, in your own fiction work, but also in nonfiction, that I found very impressive, moving and impressive. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it means a lot coming from a fellow academic. You know, it always felt to me that for me to be a writer is a very individual thing. I'm very idiosyncratic as a writer, I think, as I think all writers are. And, you know, most of the time I spend in my own head and thousands of hours alone by myself in a room. And yet I also believe very strongly in the idea of solidarity and in collective voices, and in cultivating and encouraging other voices. And that work sort of exists in tension. How do you do these two things at the same time, and what impact does it have on how I see myself as a writer, but also how I see my art and the form that it takes? And that's one of the reasons why there's so many pronoun shifts. To go back to an earlier question, as I try to talk about collectivity through individual experiences. But I always felt that, you know, what I saw when I was a student at Berkeley was the spirit of solidarity. It's one of the things that was so empowering, because my experience growing up had been one of atomization. You know, you're alone, you're lost as this, in my case, as this refugee boy, and how do I find my voice and all that kind of thing. And then coming to Berkeley, it was really inspiring to see, you know, all of these young people of various backgrounds forming their own literary magazines, their own art collectives, and developing political and aesthetic critiques and all of that. And I felt that was our task, was to build a movement, because I felt that as much as I could have accomplished myself individually, I could never have been an Asian American writer, for example, if there hadn't been generations of Asian American writers before me. I mean, I think about the fact that, you know, the earliest Asian American writers that I know about were writing at the end of the 19th century. Can you imagine how hard that was? What kind of level of incomprehension they faced? And then by the time I came along, it was not that big of a deal anymore to be an Asian American writer. And that's exactly as it should be from the generations of efforts that had come before me. So that's my attempt to try to contribute to that as a part of a movement to try to create conditions, help to create conditions for a new generation of writers who would feel the total freedom to do whatever they want to do. And so I'm totally moved by the fact that there's a whole new generation of Vietnamese American writers who are not writing about the war. I mean, they're writing science fiction, fantasy, romance, revisions of The Great Gatsby, and so on and so forth, which is exactly what they should be doing. And I feel like our obligation as scholars, writers, old people, is to open the gate and get out of the way, and let a new generation assist a new generation in saying things that might be completely different from what it is we want to say.
I had a question about names and questions of belonging and inclusion. In one of your op-eds that I very much enjoyed, you describe a situation in your childhood where you were confronting the challenge of having your name Viet and Americans not knowing this name, not being able to pronounce it, and trying on different names like Troy or Bruce or George, and describing a situation I think that many of us with unpronounceable names face, of going to the Starbucks and coming up with a fake name. Mine is Bruce, which is the name but you end that op-ed with an insistence on sort of that to deny your name would be a betrayal of your heritage, and you want to claim the name and to make Americans know your name rather than to have to change it for their sake. And this is a question, I guess, about the ambivalence of belonging, of trying, the feeling of wanting to belong to something that spurns you, I guess, which is a position that ethnic and racial minorities often find themselves in. So I wonder, how would you claim America? Is it a kind of a critical patriotism? All your discussion about amnesia and trying to bring to the fore all of the things that have forgotten. What does that feeling of belonging mean to you, I guess, is my question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. And it goes back to this idea of the individual and the collective experience that I mentioned. I think that for me as an individual for a very long time, I always felt out of place for the reasons that you're gesturing at. Never felt comfortable at home in my parents' house because I felt like an American spying on my Vietnamese parents. Never felt comfortable outside, felt like a Vietnamese spying on Americans and so on. I never felt comfortable in academia because what's this Vietnamese refugee doing in an English department? I was like, and sometimes I'm still the only Asian in the room in a lot of settings, right? So a lot of individual discomfort there, which is very productive for being a writer. And I have to confess now, though, that I feel pretty good. I feel at home because I have my own home. I have children. I have my family. I belong to them and they belong to me. So that's an individual experience that I hope we all have, right? Or can have. Collectively, however, I feel like I don't think I'll ever be at home, because let's go back to the idea of the cyclical nature of history and the massive contradictions we're all embedded in. Hey, it's awesome. Viet feels at home in his house. What about everybody else? Structurally, Asian Americans and other so-called minorities are going to be perpetually feeling displaced, and there's nothing they can do about it. They can build their own individual homes and feel comfortable there, but structurally, so-called minorities exist because of these contradictions of capitalism, colonialism, racism, imperialism, and so on. Those haven't gone away. So if we ever feel collectively at home, it's a delusion, right? That prevents us from seeing how reality actually operates. So that's why, for me, when you said claiming America, it's a very ambivalent thing to say for me, because on the one hand, I have claimed America because I'm an American citizen. But what does it mean to actually claim America? When you claim America, you claim all of it. You can't selectively claim it. You claim all of it. And when you claim all of America or the United States of America, you claim colonialism and the settler colonialism that we're all invested in by dint of owning land, or as some of us in this country. And so that means that you have to fully confront the United States of America. And that's something that a lot of people don't want to do. And so, for example, again, going back to short and long-term narratives, for Vietnamese refugees to come to this country, to claim America is really heartwarming in some ways for Americans, because Americans can say, hey, look, this is the American dream. Sorry about the war, but here you are now. You can claim America. And then as a Vietnamese refugee, you've escaped from one colonization and you've claimed another colonization. And again, I think that's something that a lot of Vietnamese refugees, but not just Vietnamese refugees, a lot of refugees and immigrants don't want to acknowledge, are not equipped to acknowledge. And if they don't acknowledge it, then what do they claim? They claim the ongoing unaware reproduction of these cycles of history and contradictions and so on that will be repeated for the next generation. So why should we feel at home by claiming that kind of a home? I think that's part of what the critical work that I'm engaged in and that so many other people are engaged in is trying to point out.
Maybe we'll take one more question.
Thank you so much for being here. As part of our class, we had to read not had to read, but we were joyed to read your refugee book. And we read the introduction, and I was really struck by the presence of memory and the importance of memory. And you said multiple times how you were between remembering and not remembering your early experiences in coming here. And as someone who, has had to shoulder so much cultural responsibility, how have you been able to feel that you're providing an authentic voice to the voiceless, as you spoke about?
Wow, tough question. Well, I'm reading the scripts for the Sympathizer TV series right now, and I'm actually playing the role of authenticity consultant. It's like, this people did not say this, so it's sort of an awkward position to be in. And of course, there's a lot of demand for what you're saying. This authenticity issue comes not just from people outside of my culture, whatever that is, but also from within. There can be a lot of Vietnamese people reading my books, watching this TV series, who are going to be looking very carefully over these questions of authentic representation or misrepresentation. So there's a real challenge, responsibility, burden there, and so on. And yet at the same time, I think that part of this freedom of representation that I'm talking about, what that entails is the freedom to be unique and to be weird. I read one critical review of the Sympathizer where the reviewer said, and the Vietnamese American reviewer said, a Vietnamese refugee wouldn't say these things or do this stuff. I'm like, how do you know? Does anyone read Moby Dick and think Ishmael is not a typical American? You don't have that kind of a response. So why is it that when so-called minorities write, it's like you have to adhere to some average notion of whatever it is that your so-called minority is supposed to be? And that's an expectation from the outside and the inside at the same time. So it's a tricky balance. Again, going back to the individual and collective issue, yes, I feel an obligation to be ethical, to be respectful. I have an awareness of the burdens placed upon me by my fellow Vietnamese people. And yet I also want to just shrug those off and create unique, idiosyncratic individual characters, because I've met a lot of weird Vietnamese people who don't fit under any kind of average expectation, and they're completely erased from our stereotypical and self-stereotypical notions of what it means to be Vietnamese as well. And so part of the liberatory power of art is to liberate us to be who we are individually, even as we're aware of these demands to be collectively something. That's the tension, that's the drama, that's the burden, that's the opportunity that falls on us as so-called minority people in a so-called majority country, an awareness that we must have and something that we must contest and challenge all at the same time. I wish you luck in doing that, and thanks to all of you for being here and listening to me.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. And yet your generosity, thank you. I mean, you are as generous as you are wise. Just the time and the care with which you answered everyone's question is something I think we will all treasure. So thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Dag.
All right.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah.